Hey, this is Jacob Eben. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Sermon on the Mount, specifically the latter half of Matthew 5, wherein Yeshua refers to, "You have heard it was said, but I say to you." Is this teaching Torah? And in what ways does it teach Torah? We're going to be thinking about this with more nuance and specific detail, and we're going to be looking at specific Torah passages along the way. And from the beginning, we might consider Matthew 5, 17 through 20 as a sort of initial frame for how we might look at what comes after it. "You should not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, until heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall not pass from the law until all comes to be. Whosoever then shall loosen one of the least of these commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of the heavens. Whosoever shall do and teach, this one shall be called great in the kingdom of the heavens. For I say to you that if your righteousness shall not exceed more than these scribes and the Pharisees, you shall not enter into the kingdom of the heavens." So we have this statement that he did not come to destroy the law or the prophets, and we should pay attention to a statement of intentions, this introduction here. This word used for fulfill is what we commonly see in the other passages in this book, which might say something like, "Thus it was fulfilled what was said by such and such prophet," and then it gives some small reference to a prophecy or a passage from one of those books. There is also this statement that nothing is going to pass from the law until everything occurs, until all comes to be. So even based upon that verse alone, one would probably conclude that the law is at least not being done away with. And then continuing into the next verse, we have this statement about, "Whosoever then shall loosen one of the least of these commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of the heavens." And it's probably reasonable to think that these commandments might be talking about the law, talking about the Torah, since that is the context that comes before it. And there are some other passages that support the Torah in a general sense, which appear in Matthew at least, such as in Matthew 23, 2 through 3, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees are seated on the seat of Moses. Therefore, all whatsoever they say to you, be keeping it and be doing it. But do not do according to their works, for they are saying and they are not doing." And in the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, which I referenced for this study and will be talking about further, it can be read, "Therefore all whatsoever he says to you." And one interpretation of the he in question is that it was just talking about the seat of Moses, so this he could be talking about Moses. Do all that Moses says is an interpretation of that. So we have these general statements, and while we could just say, as I actually heard in a scriptural discussion one time, stop reading right there, don't read any more. On the other hand, I think we can continue to be curious, because it could be useful to continue looking at what else Matthew 5 says. Glossing over something can result in a different conclusion from actually investigating the details. And as we go into these teachings of commands in Matthew 5, I want to reiterate the questions that I posed at the beginning of the video. Is this teaching Torah? And in what ways does it teach Torah? So instead of just rushing through it and trying to fit it into either a pass, no pass type of frame, I want to be curious and wonder about the details. And if we are thinking about what form this takes as far as teaching Torah, we might consider something like these general categories of teaching Torah, a 5-option scale regarding teaching Torah. And this is just one way of looking at it. Everyone has their own ways of wording things and categorizing things, but I think this could be a useful frame, and we can apply it to a lot of different instances, including our own way of thinking about the law or talking about the law, and we can consider it more fully after we have completed the video and as we are studying this issue further. And option 1 on this scale of teaching Torah or teaching just Torah could be quoting Torah or reading Torah. So a person could be literally just reading straight out of the text of the Torah word for word. Or a person could be quoting from the Torah word for word based upon memory. And at its most basic level, assuming that there's nothing else involved, and assuming it is the Hebrew text that is being read or quoted, this would be indisputable as far as it only being Torah and it being teaching Torah alone. However, to be fair about it, that is assuming that nothing else is involved, and rarely does anyone just read the entire text of the Torah word for word without any context being raised or any question coming before it. If someone were to ask a question, then the person answering the question, even by answering with a verse from the Torah alone, probably is contributing something of their own just by choosing a passage to read or by not choosing another passage to read. So that's not to say this is always a problem because it's just inevitable, but even just reading or quoting the text can involve some level of added information or removed information, either by the person listening or the person reading it. But either way, reading or quoting the Hebrew text is going to be the closest to the Torah of this scale. Option 2 is what I will call contemplating Torah. So instead of just straight reading it out of the Hebrew text, there may be a translation involved. There may be a discussion of the meaning of certain words and the meaning of certain phrases. There may be a recognition of other references that may relate to a given passage or to a given topic, and those might be brought in. And there may be questions about how does one apply a command in certain circumstances? What are the limits of the command, etc.? Basically, this would be emphasizing what it says, seeking to understand what it says, and seeking to understand how to do it. So from a teaching perspective, that would be a step away from just purely reading the Hebrew text and expecting everything to be understood. If a person is talking about a command in the Torah and explaining the wording or linking it to other verses that are clearly related to it, or contemplating how to apply the command, that's not just reading or quoting the command. There is clear input by the person which is being added into it. But that would be with the intent of focusing on the text, and that's what I would consider contemplating Torah. Option 3 is reinterpreting Torah. For those of you that are aware of some of the common Pharisaic or rabbinic approaches to the text, you've seen this plenty of times, and this shows up frequently in most churches as well, and frankly, it is a very attractive approach to most of the public. Most people like to hear this approach, and most people like to teach from this approach. And by reinterpreting, I mean going beyond what it actually says, distorting the context, trying to find hidden meanings or hidden symbols in the text for something which is completely unrelated to the text at hand. And essentially, it's viewing the text as a means of teaching someone's personal ideas, personal beliefs, as if they were fact. We've all seen this. We've all seen the text just used as a tool for one's agenda, even in cases where it is unintentional. Even when the person thinks he or she is doing the right thing, because the person probably thinks his agenda is the right thing. So this is extremely common because most people think it is acceptable to do to some extent and don't really recognize what it is. And it happens even when a person tries to avoid it. In the process of this approach, a person might reference the Torah or say that he agrees with what it says in the Torah, and it might seem to some as if it were the same as just contemplating the Torah. But there will often be some clear red flags if we watch out for them, like needing to say that the text supposedly implies some teaching, or needing to change wordings in the text, or not being able to prove a claim without a very long and complicated explanation, because the resulting teaching is not clearly within the Torah, and it's not legitimately linked to what the Torah actually says. So this would be reinterpreting Torah. Option 4 is outright adding to the Torah, and of course this can easily overlap with the previous option if we are alert to it. So most of us are probably already aware of Deuteronomy 4:2 and Deuteronomy 13:1, which is also known as Deuteronomy 12:32. Deuteronomy 4:2 says that you shall not add on to the word which I am commanding you, and you shall not diminish from it. We have this command about not adding to the word which is being commanded. So for a person to follow the law in full perfectly, then this command would be part of that law. And as we know, there can be teachings out there by various teachers that support the Torah and teach from the Torah, and also add things which are not from the Torah. And if that thing which is being added is being taught as if it were law, as if it were the command, then this would apparently be adding to the word which was commanded. When you get down to it, there is often a fine line between this option and the previous one, Reinterpreting Torah, and the people who are clever about it or are good at presentation are often very capable of making their addition to the law sound like it is a good thing or even supposedly the intent of what the text said. And if a person is motivated to believe some sort of new command and doesn't want to recognize this for what it is, we can be very clever about reframing how we view this person's adding to the law. I've pointed out an addition to the law at one point in the past, and I got a response that it wasn't actually adding to the law, it was just creating a new commanded way of doing things that was different from the law. So think about that for a second. If we're not in the situation, it can be easy to see how creating a new commanded way of doing things that is different from the law is in fact adding to the law. It is taking away from the word which was commanded in the law, but that's assuming we're not in it. We're not in the situation and we don't have some kind of conflicting motive at play. And that is something we want to be watching out for because it's part of the law and we don't want to be taken in by it and start adding to the law ourselves as a result, whether through our own claims or by listening to those who are adding to the law. And finally, option 5 is openly disregarding Torah. This would be if a teacher were to admit that he disagrees with the law or is teaching something different from what it says, and he is speaking without concern for that fact. Of course, there are also the more obvious forms of atheistic teaching or teachings from other belief systems which result in disregarding the Torah. But unfortunately, this same approach goes on more often than one might expect in our own pro-Torah circles. There is the practice of taking away from the word which was commanded. There is always some command that a person would do differently if he or she were the one writing the law, if they were Elohim. And sometimes a person will get the idea that it is up to him or her, and may justify it by saying that he supposedly knows what the text originally said, even though he has no such text in his possession. Or by a person saying he thinks the way it was done in the Torah is wrong according to him, or was only for that time. And instead we supposedly need to go back to before the command was given in order to disregard the Torah command on that subject. The mind is a complicated thing, so a person can claim to regard the Torah while also openly disregarding or disdaining parts of the Torah. In my view, those are some of the more insidious or dangerous forms of disregarding the Torah, and this happens more often than we might have acknowledged before. This is a 5-option scale, a scale of teaching Torah. And as we are going back into looking at the sermon, 6 teachings from Matthew 5, I'm going to jump around a bit from section to section, but I encourage you to go through the passage on your own afterward in order. For now, let's start with Matthew 5, 33 through 37, the passage about swearing and oaths. There is a noteworthy difference here between the standard manuscript that most people use and the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, which some people have held the belief that the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew may be more original at least in some circles. And so we're going to look at both here and with some other passages. This section starts out in the more standard manuscripts by saying, "Again, you heard it was declared to the ancients, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall pay to the Lord your oaths. But I say to you, do not swear at all, not by heaven, for it is the throne of God." And it goes over some more examples before concluding with, "But let your word be yes, yes, no, no. But what is more than these is of the evil one." So you heard it was declared, and then there is this statement of not swearing falsely and also paying to the Lord your oaths. But he says to not swear at all, effectively because it is all swearing by God indirectly, and that one's word should just be a straight yes or no. The Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew has a different wording here, and to clarify before we start looking at it, it doesn't use the name of Elohim here in the Hebrew text I'm looking at. There is a substitution for the name instead, even though it is a Hebrew text, and it censors the word Elohim as well. So that is the reason you will see and you will hear what you do as we look at these passages. "Again, you have heard what was said to the ancients. You shall not swear by my name for falsehood, and you shall return to the Elohim your oath. And I say to you to not swear in vain in any way, not by the heavens, because it is the throne of Elohim." And that concludes with, "But your words shall be yes, yes, and also no, no. Anything in addition to this, it is evil." As you can see, there is a slightly different message with this version, and that's the first thing we need to recognize about this section. In the typical reading of this, as we saw before, all oaths are basically treated as swearing by Elohim directly. And so you should just say yes or no and not swear at all. If you have studied the commands of the Torah, you know that there are actually commands to swear and that require swearing, such as Exodus 22, verse 10 or 11, etc. And swearing is certainly allowed, although it is regulated. And maybe as a result of that, we can see a difference here in the presentation of the Shem Tov variation of this text. The statement is instead to not swear in vain, or to not swear falsely at all. And the teaching's reason for this is because you are effectively swearing by Elohim either way, and you're not allowed to swear falsely by his name. And there is another passage in Matthew 23 that appears to have a similar teaching to this reading of it across both manuscripts, because it says that he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one sitting upon it. So both of these manuscripts in the Matthew 23 passage support the Shem Tov variation of the Matthew 5 oaths passage. We would have a more consistent reading on this particular point by using the Shem Tov version. And while I would normally caution that just because one manuscript seems more consistent than another one, that doesn't automatically make it more correct or more original, and it may make more sense on that point, but there's nothing keeping someone from coming along and fixing something later. On the other hand, when it comes to this swearing and oaths issue, we are dealing with the same teaching showing up in another spot in the text. And so I'm going to focus on the more consistent reading of this for the purposes of the study. Now that we have that manuscript point sorted out for this section, let's look in a little more depth at the teaching itself. It starts off by saying, "You have heard what was said." And there are a few variations of this, as we will see. This one refers to the ancients, but it starts off by quoting a command which appears to be from the law, at least in part. When it says, "You shall not swear by my name for falsehood," that also appears in Leviticus 19:12. That is part of the command which appears there. "And you shall not swear by my name for falsehood, and profane the name of your Elohim." So there is this emphasis here, at least in the Torah, that swearing falsely by his name is profaning his name. The first part of this reference in Matthew 5 is apparently from this command in the Torah. And then there is this second part in the reference, the "you shall return to the Elohim," shall we say, "you shall return your oaths." That wording does not show up in the text. There are a few passages that may be a similar idea to this, and if we take the word which is translated as return in the sense of how it shows up in Numbers 18:9 in terms of rendering offerings or repaying with offerings, or if we treat it as answer, such as answering for oaths, we might think of Deuteronomy 23, verse 22 or 21, depending on the numbering system, as a command which could be similar. While that command is not written anywhere close to the wording in Matthew 5, it could convey a similar idea. It says that if you make a vow to Elohim, you shall not delay to complete it or repay it. Otherwise, maybe this Matthew 5 reference is actually a reference to something which is not a command, possibly a tradition on the subject or a teaching, instead of actually referring to the text. If that is what is going on here, that would be similar to many of the other passages which we are going to look at, wherein these introductions appear to reference some teaching rather than just what the Torah says. So part of it appears to be referring to the command, and part of it may be some teaching or tradition. Now let's think about this teaching which follows the introduction. As we've seen in the passage already, the message appears to be that a person can't just weasel his way out of an oath just because he didn't use the name when he swore, that he didn't swear by the name, and that oaths could indirectly be swearing by the Creator, and that you should just be straight and truthful. And I want to refer back to this frame of the scale of teaching Torah. The first category on that list was reading Torah or quoting Torah. Is this just reading or quoting the Torah? The only thing that appears to be quoting the Torah is just the one part of that command we already looked at, the part of Leviticus 19:12 where it says, "You shall not swear by my name for falsehood." And then the verse goes on to say some other things which are not quoted in Matthew 5. Most of the teaching is not any quotation of the text, and so that leads us to other options on the scale, such as option 2. Is it just taking a practice of the time and then comparing that to the Torah text and then rebuking and correcting that practice with what is written in the Torah text? Is it just exploring and then debunking the misapplication of a command from the text? I would note that it doesn't clearly reference any command in this actual teaching which is given or in the conclusion when he says that this is what you need to do. However, we could just say that this is a point of style, and there are commands which could support the general message here. For example, in Numbers 30, it says that if a man swears an oath, that he is not to profane his word, but that he shall do what came out of his mouth. It doesn't say that it has to be made in the name for it to matter or for it to bind the person, but instead, this verse indicates that making an oath to bind oneself is an oath that needs to be upheld regardless of all of that. So I would see that as coinciding with the overall message here, even though there is no reference in Matthew 5 to that verse. While this could just be seen as focusing on the details, as far as the category of reinterpreting Torah is concerned, this may be a category that we may not want to totally dismiss here because of how the teaching is framed. The teaching is not just that you're obligated to uphold all of your oaths, but it is explaining how swearing upon things other than the name of the Creator is equivalent to swearing by the Creator. I wanted to notice that because of this verse that we connected it to in Leviticus 19:12, "And you shall not swear by my name for falsehood and profane the name of your Elohim." That verse itself seems to be emphasizing that there is a problem with misusing his name. So the teaching that swearing by other things is basically equivalent to it, that doesn't seem to be what is conveyed here in the text of the command. So I wouldn't consider this section in Matthew 5 to just be a clean example of referencing only what the Torah says and only emphasizing that. But for the most part, the general idea, the overall practical result of the teaching, wherein one is honoring his oaths or honoring his word, that would fit with the commands of the Torah. Let's go to Matthew 5, 27 through 30. This is the adultery and lust passage. You have heard that it was declared to the ancients, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone looking toward a woman to covet her already commits adultery with her in his heart. And then the passage goes on to refer to removing parts of your body if you need to in order to avoid sinning and damnation. And the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew reads pretty similarly. First, I'd like to say how this is kind of a breath of fresh air to see how seriously doing the right thing is taken here, that one should prefer it over having their body intact. That is often not the type of passage which is emphasized in traditional Christianity as we know, and it's almost the opposite teaching of that which we see here. Turning to the portion about the adultery and the coveting. So this may already be a slightly different way of looking at things from what we might have heard before. The choice of the word covet for the translation instead of lust may already be shedding some light on it. And in the Shem Tov, it is the same Hebrew word we see in Exodus 20:17 about not coveting. And we should also note the use of the word for adultery. Adultery implies a specific situation, that is, another man's wife. So this statement about not coveting such a person is the same practical command as not coveting your neighbor's wife, the command that appears in the Torah. Clearly, coveting your neighbor's wife, since it's already said explicitly, fits pretty cleanly with the text of the Torah. That specific part, that is. The main question I would have about this is the part about committing adultery with her in his heart. The Torah text doesn't say anything about that whenever it gives the command about not coveting. Adultery is treated with severe punishment in terms of Torah judgment, and that is capital punishment upon both parties. On the other hand, coveting itself is never commanded to have a specific punishment. If a particular act of coveting were something that could be proven, and that would probably be difficult to do, the person could receive a smiting or beating or lashes in response to it. But that would be very different from the death penalty for both parties. Of course, the person coveting didn't actually commit the adultery, and the Matthew 5 passage doesn't say he actually did that. It says that he has done it in his heart, or we might understand that as his mind. And one reading of that would just be that if a person is coveting his neighbor's wife, he is imagining committing adultery with her. And while that is probably true, that seems to be an unsatisfactory or incomplete explanation to this verse, in my opinion. Although that would essentially fit with the Torah text from that view. If it is saying that coveting is morally equivalent to adultery, then that's not something which is really elaborated upon in the Torah text. While not committing adultery and not coveting are both commands that should not be broken, there is a reference to a sin of death or a sin worthy of death in the Torah, and not everything in the Torah falls under that. So the question here is not so much about whether coveting your neighbor's wife is forbidden, because clearly it is, but it's more about what is being indicated here in the second verse. And if we just take it as saying you can't covet your neighbor's wife, it fits with the Torah fine. And that would fit with the Contemplating Torah in the categories we've been considering. If it is saying something more than that, then we might be getting further into the Reinterpreting Torah side of things, because that angle is not clearly in the Torah text. Now let's look at Matthew 5, 38 through 42, the eye for an eye passage. You have heard that it was declared, eye instead of an eye, tooth instead of a tooth. But I say to you, do not oppose evil, but anyone who shall slap you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. And to the one wanting you to be judged and to obtain your tunic, leave to him also the cloak. And anyone who shall compel you to go 1,000 paces, go with him too. Give to the one asking you, and do not turn away the one wanting to borrow from you. And we can compare this to the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, which has a few variations. And again, you have heard what is said in the Torah, eye instead of an eye, tooth instead of a tooth. And I say to you, do not repay evil instead of evil. And the rest of it is essentially the same. So you have heard what is said in the Torah, eye instead of an eye. This is a quote from the Torah. This part shows up in Exodus 21:24, and it also shows up in Leviticus 24:20. In those passages, though, it is framed as a matter of judgment. It says that at the beginning of Exodus 21 and elsewhere that these are judgments, and these surrounding verses talk about punishment, judges, and mediators. The command in the Torah is not laid out as a way of just conducting your personal affairs, your personal relationships, at least how I would see it. And with this Matthew 5 passage, the teaching is not laying out how the judges are to handle the court cases or handle punishment for crimes. It seems to be more about your personal day-to-day dealings with people. So even though it is saying that you have heard that it was declared, or that you have heard what is said in the Torah, but I say to you, even though at face value it might seem like maybe it's going against what the Torah says, it's not necessarily. The court can still handle things a certain way, eye for an eye, and then in your personal affairs you can still choose to not hate your brother in your heart, like it says in Leviticus 19:17. And you can choose to not avenge and not bear a grudge against the children of your people, which it says in Leviticus 19:18. If it is understood as not repaying evil with evil, and if that is understood as talking about your brethren, talking about people of the Israelite community, of the nation, then the command in the Torah text which says to not avenge could very well fit here. If you're slapped, you don't have to slap them back, for example. And one interpretation of the next part of being sued, just letting the person have the article, getting it over with, a person might say that by doing that, you are reducing the likelihood that your fellow Israelite is going to bear a grudge against you or hate you in his heart over the ordeal. So maybe you are helping him to observe the command by doing that. And with the do not turn away the one wanting to borrow from you, this could easily be connected with Deuteronomy 15:7-8. It says that you shall surely open your hand to your needy brother. For the most part, if we understand it in the way of separating personal affairs from the judgment of the court, then most of this fits well with the commands that exist in the Torah text. Most of these ideas can be projected upon certain Torah commands, or we can work out a basis for saying that it's just paraphrasing certain Torah commands and applying them to specific situations. The only thing which is being quoted from the Torah here, going back to our scale of teaching Torah, the quoting Torah, would be the eye for an eye part. If this were worded differently or presented differently, once again, maybe that's just a stylistic point, but if it were presented differently, it could very easily fall under this Contemplating Torah category. We could work out a way to see it that way. As with any issue of the text or issue of a text which might be considered scripture, it is important that we pay attention to what is actually said. We can pay attention to how it is actually worded. There can be a difference between what the text actually says and what we think it is implying, and that can be important to notice. When it comes to applying this teaching and comparing that with the Torah text, the main issue I would raise is whether we are considering this a clear matter of law. And if we want to be careful and thorough about our comparison here, then it's important we consider other angles. While there are commands about lending, as referred to earlier, there aren't commands in the Torah that tell you to just submit to anything your brother demands of you. If someone wants to bring a matter before the judges and effectively sue you over something, the command does not require you to resolve that outside of court. And outside of a case of theft or misappropriation of offerings or similar, It doesn't require you to hand over whatever the person demands plus more, especially before any giving of a judgment. And also, there is no command that requires you to do whatever your brother asks of you unconditionally, even if it is to prevent them from hating you. You're not obligated to be hit by someone and then invite the person to hit you again by the text of the Torah. And this is all assuming that we are only talking about the people within the community and the nation, rather than just anyone smiting you or anyone extorting you in any context. If it is just to be taken as good advice, then maybe it's perfectly fine advice, but then we would have to wonder about the purpose behind the teaching. So while we could take the angle that it is contemplating Torah, that the teaching is just not very explicit about the relevant Torah command, and we might just assume that it is implying some connection to the Torah despite the teaching not being very clear about that. On the other hand, someone could place the emphasis on what the passage says and take another view as a result. Next, we can look at Matthew 5:43-48, and this is the love your neighbor, hate your enemy passage. You have heard that it was declared, you shall love your neighbor and you shall hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless the ones cursing you, do good to the ones hating you, and pray for the ones disparaging you and ones persecuting you, so that you shall become sons of your Father, the one in the heavens. For his sun rises on wicked ones and good ones, and it is raining on just ones and unjust ones. For if you love the ones loving you, what reward do you have? Don't the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what more are you doing? Don't the tax collectors do so? You shall then be perfect, even as your Father in the heavens is perfect. In the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew, there is mainly a difference in the first verse. You have heard what was said to the ancients, and you shall love the one loving you, and you shall hate the one hating you. And the other main difference is that verse 47 is missing from the Hebrew manuscripts that I'm checking. The part about greeting your brothers is just not there. So from the beginning, we can see that this quotation or reference is not actually a command from the Torah. There is the command in Leviticus 19:18 about loving your neighbor as yourself or loving your companion as yourself. It doesn't go on to say hate your enemy, and nor does it say to love the one who loves you and hate the one who hates you. The Matthew reference appears to be talking about something different. When it comes to what is said in the Torah text, we've already considered passages about not hating your brother, or bearing a grudge, or avenging. We have seen those are prohibited as per Leviticus 19. And there are also commands that talk about people that hate you, or talk about your enemy, such as in Exodus 23:4-5. When you shall meet the bull of your enemy or his donkey straying, you shall surely return it to him. When you shall see the donkey of one hating you crouching under its burden, and you would refrain from putting it in order, you shall surely put it in order. So there is a command in the Torah to do well toward your enemies, at least in that specific way. But it's important that we recognize when a Torah command is about a specific point, about a specific issue. There is not a generalized command in the Torah text which says to love your enemy in general, or to do favorable things to your enemy. And if we connect those commands to Deuteronomy 22:1, that enemy or one hating you who owns the bull or donkey could be equated with one of your brethren that hates you or that you dislike, because Deuteronomy 22:1 has a similar command referring to your brother. And if that's the case, then all of these commands about your brother and your companion or your neighbor would apply to the difficult person who is among your brethren. So you would be expected to do well toward them because of those commands. And that clarification of defining the enemy may be important in terms of how we view this Matthew 5 passage. Did the enemy or the one persecuting you include the Romans and other nations that had been oppressing them or were oppressing them at that point? Or does Matthew 5 just refer to the people of the community that you don't like or that don't like you, and also the people who are your brethren but are also complicit with the Roman government and are therefore oppressing you as a result. Are those the people we are referring to in this Matthew 5 passage? This question may cause us to refer back to the different wordings on verse 43. Is the context, you shall love your neighbor and you shall hate your enemy? Or is the context, you shall love the one loving you and you shall hate the one hating you, as it shows up in the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew? If it is the latter, if it's the love the one loving you, hate the one hating you, if that is what is being refuted, then it's easier to fit this in with what shows up in the Torah commands. But if it is literally anyone, if there is a distinction between your neighbor and your enemy, like with the more standard reading of the passage, then this would be much harder to force it to fit in with the Torah. For example, Deuteronomy 30, an important but often ignored or missed passage, which talks about the future restoration of Israel, the people being reassembled from all the nations they have been scattered and being brought back into the land and observing all of the Torah again, even the ceremonial laws. You can see in Deuteronomy 30 verse 7 that Elohim is going to place curses upon those who are your enemies, those who hate you, those who persecute you. A person could say that this is talking about what Elohim is doing, what the Creator is doing, and it's not talking about what you individually are doing, and that is true with respect to that one verse, and it certainly is talking about a specific situation here in Deuteronomy 30. But if one is seeing Matthew 5 as a teaching of law and the way that things should be done, doesn't it seem odd to pray for these people or to bless them in the context of Elohim cursing them? Likewise, this would be similar to Exodus 23:22. For if you shall surely listen in his voice and do all which I am saying, I shall be an enemy to your enemies, and I shall distress the ones distressing you. And also we should consider a verse regarding the Ammonites and the Moabites. Deuteronomy 23 verse 7, also known as verse 6. You shall not seek their well-being and their good all of your days forever. And that's once again in the context of the Ammonites and the Moabites. Now maybe we could say that the Matthew 5 teaching just doesn't apply to Ammonites or Moabites, and that some of the other Torah references are in the context of warfare, the taking of the land of Canaan, Canaan, or the freeing of the people to return to the land as prophesied. And we could say that maybe the command or the teaching in Matthew 5 is about those situations that aren't warfare, or maybe it's just referring to situations involving your fellow within the community that hates you. Those are some considerations which would come into play if we want to truly assess these statements in Matthew. So if we prefer the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew reading here, then it would be easier to fit this in with the category of Contemplating Torah. One could take the angle that it is just teaching that all of the Torah commands about loving your fellow within the community still apply no matter what you think of the person or what they think of you. That's not the explicit wording here, once again, but it's not a stretch to say that the Shem Tov version is justifiable in that perspective. If a person insisted on another reading of it, then we are nowhere close to teaching from the commands here, and at the very best it would be reinterpreting the Torah, but considering it is spoken so authoritatively, because the passage frames obedience to this teaching as a requirement to be the sons of the Father, and it frames it as being a part of being perfect or being complete with the Creator, I would understand that angle more in the light of being adding to the law, and depending on the details, maybe even disregarding certain parts of the Torah. And that's assuming that we're taking the standard reading of it rather than the Shem Tov reading of it, which may fit the category of Contemplating Torah. Now let's go into Matthew 5:21 through 26, and this is the anger passage. You heard that it was declared to the ancients, you shall not murder, but whoever shall murder shall be subject to judgment. But I say to you that everyone being angry with his brother without cause shall be subject to judgment. But whoever shall say to his brother, worthless, shall be subject to the council. And whoever shall say, stupid, shall be subject to the Gehenna fire. Therefore, if you are offering your gift on the altar, and there you are reminded that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift there before the altar, and go first to be reconciled with your brother, and then come to offer your gift. Quickly reconcile with your adversary while you are in the way with him, lest the adversary deliver you to the judge, and the judge deliver you to the officer, and you are thrown in prison. Surely I say to you, you shall not come out from there until you pay the last coin. The notable variations in the Shem Tov version of this are at the beginning. Have you not heard what was said to the ancients? You shall not murder, and he who shall murder is subject to a judgment of death. And I say to you, he who provokes his companion to anger is subject to judgment. And he who calls his brother inferior shall be subject to the judgment of the assembly. And he who calls him a fool is subject to the fire of Gehinnom. The main differences between these readings is that the Shem Tov refers to murder receiving a judgment of death rather than simply judgment without that clarification. And as far as I can tell, the Shem Tov appears to refer to provoking your companion to anger being subject to judgment rather than you being angry with your brother without cause. Clearly the you shall not murder or you shall not manslaughter is word for word from the Torah. It's from Exodus 20:13. The latter portion of this, which was also said to be declared to the ancients, this part about being subject to judgment or being subject to judgment of death, that wording does not appear in the text. Certainly it could be said to be a paraphrase or a simplification of what the Torah text says, but it's just not worded in that way, so it's not quoting the Torah. We know that there is a whole chapter of the Torah in Numbers 35 that goes over many details of this command regarding the exceptions and the application of that kind of judgment. So there's clearly more to it than what is said here in Matthew 5, but there are similar statements in the Torah about a man who smites any human life shall be put to death, such as Leviticus 24:17, without all of the details and the exceptions and the ways of applying it being mentioned there. So it is a simplification, but that's understandable, especially since the murdering part is probably not the point of the teaching. Then it goes into the but I say to you or and I say to you part of the teaching. And the standard reading of it says that one who is angry with his brother without cause shall be subject to judgment. Just like it says with one murdering is subject to judgment. Being angry with your brother is clearly being compared with murder, maybe in a similar way to the adultery and the coveting issue in the other passage. In the Shem Tov version, it softens that comparison a bit because it says judgment of death with murder and just judgment with the provoking your companion to anger, and that's another slight variation. Then calling your brother worthless or inferior is subject to another level of judgment, and then calling him a fool or stupid is subject to the fire of Gehenna or the fire of the valley of Hinnom. And although that place is never mentioned in the Torah, that is an actual physical location in the land of Canaan, Canaan, and the book of Jeremiah describes it as a place where people were burning their children in fire. But it is later referred to as a place where the wicked are supposed to be sent after death. There is also an interesting part in this passage about whenever you are bringing your offerings before the altar. Apparently the context of doing offerings or sacrifices is relevant enough to provide as an example for this teaching. If your brother is mad at you, then you're supposed to fix that immediately. Then finally, like we saw in another one of the Matthew 5 teachings, you're supposed to agree with the plaintiff and settle the matter as quickly as possible Otherwise, you'll be thrown in the slammer and you'll pay in spades. And the question is, like we've been considering along the way, are these passages teaching Torah? We have looked at some verses from the Torah about not hating your brother in your heart and not bearing a grudge. And we've also considered that maybe it would be good to try and sort things out with your brother in order to prevent your brother from sinning by bearing a grudge against you. Although I wonder if that is always realistic. But if you say something in anger toward your brother, or if you feel anger toward him suddenly, might that not be different from hating him in your heart, at least in some cases? Or if we use the Shem Tov reading, what about provoking a person to anger? Is there any basis in a Torah command to say that would be judged in a Torah-based court? To me, some of this seems to be outside of the scope of the commands. There is one other part of this I want to mention that's probably overlooked most of the time because, in my view, there is no respect for ritual anymore, even the commanded rituals of the Torah, and that is the portion about delaying your offering. Part of this teaching is that reconciling with your brother is of utmost importance, even to the degree that it is more important than performing an offering that you are in the middle of doing. Certainly if a person is engaging in sin, engaging in a violation of a Torah command, then the person needs to fix that ASAP. However, there are commands in the Torah which say that certain offerings have to be done at certain time, and there are commands which say you are not allowed to delay to perform the offering. Exodus 22:28, also known as 22:29, says, "You shall not delay with your fullness and your juice." And Deuteronomy 23:22, also known as verse 21, says, "You shall not delay to perform it," when it comes to an offering over a vow. Whereas this Matthew 5 passage, it is certainly conveying that resolving something your brother has against you is important enough to delay an offering, something which the Torah commands, at least in some cases, that you shall not delay it. And I realize that these commanded ways of worshiping the Creator are so distant from us today in the absence of the tent of meeting, and just in how these matters have been diminished in teaching since then. But if you have a question as to how the Torah treats these matters of ritual, feel free to do a study of which matters in the Torah receive the death penalty, or which matters result in death according to the Torah, and you may be surprised at how seriously the rituals and the ceremonies, the commanded ways of worship of the Creator, are taken. So with this Matthew 5 teaching about being angry or about provoking anger from your brother, I would not consider it to just be contemplating Torah. If we break up each individual part of it, each component may end up on a slightly different part of the scale, and maybe a person could say that this is on the line as far as the line between reinterpreting Torah and adding to the Torah. Certainly by saying that something is subject to judgment, such as judgment of the community or the council, that is a statement of law, it's not just advice. And the part about delaying the offering, there is the possibility that someone could end up violating a Torah command by following that part of the Matthew 5 teaching. So I wonder where on the scale that might place it. And now for the last one, Matthew 5:31 through 32. This is the divorce passage. "But it was declared that whoever shall dismiss his wife, let him give to her a divorce declaration. But I say to you that whoever shall dismiss his wife outside of a matter of sexual immorality is causing her to commit adultery. And whoever shall marry her that was dismissed is committing adultery." And the Shem Tov reads, "You have heard what was said to the ancients, that everyone leaving his wife and sending her, give to her a divorce document, and in foreign language, libella repudio. And I say to you that every man leaving his wife is to give her a divorce document. But except over a matter of adultery, he is the adulterer, and the one taking her is committing adultery." There is a fair bit of difference in this wording, and some of it is more significant than the rest. The main difference in reading is that the Shem Tov has a reiteration of the need to do the divorce document, and that he is committing adultery rather than her. He is the adulterer. What is this teaching conveying? It says that it was declared to the ancients that anyone sending away his wife needs to give her a divorce document. This is what Deuteronomy 24:1 says, as we will see. And then it indicates that unless this is done because of adultery or because of sexual immorality, adultery is going to result from this. And the way it would result is presumably because they are still considered married despite the divorce. That's why the person marrying her after her divorce would be considered an adulterer from that frame. And interestingly, I'll let you mull this over on your own, the man who divorced her is also said to be committing adultery. Feel free to think about that one. Although this passage does not word it in the way that Deuteronomy 24:1 does, it appears to be alluding back to it. It is a different wording, but it is a partial paraphrase of what it says in the Torah text about needing to prepare a divorce document and sending her out of his house. And the question we want to answer is, how does the Torah frame this matter? It refers to a man whose wife no longer finds favor in his sight because he finds some shameful thing about her or some unbecoming thing about her. It doesn't use the word for adultery here. And then she is sent away with the documentation of the divorce. At this point, does the Torah say that a man marrying that divorced woman is committing adultery? It says nothing of that sort. It actually says that the original man who sent her away cannot take her back to be his wife again after she has been the woman of another man, and that's according to Deuteronomy 24:4. So if they were still married, then how is it that he cannot take her back? And if there is any question as to whether these Torah commands are able to be forced into the mold of Matthew 5 regarding divorce, we can actually look to elsewhere in Matthew for the answer on that. Matthew 19:7-9 makes this clear. It says that the Pharisees asked him about this issue, and even in the Shem Tov version of Matthew 19, they still argue about, paraphrased, why did Moses say this if it's not how it's supposed to be? And the response is that Moses did command it that way, but that's not how it's supposed to be. And it should be noted that there is no teaching in the Gospels that the Torah was supposedly edited by some rogue individuals and that the Torah was supposedly being corrected with these teachings. That could easily have been clarified if it were the intent, but instead this passage in Matthew just says Moses. And when explaining how it wasn't from the ancient times, it wasn't that way before, the teaching doesn't refer to the original giving of the Torah to Moses. It doesn't say it wasn't originally in the Torah, but it goes back to before the Exodus and before the events at Mount Sinai. It says that because there was a time before the command was given, therefore the command in the Torah text is being rejected. So we have an explicit contrast between the commandment in the Torah, the commandment through Moses explicitly, through Moses, and the new teaching in the Gospels. Now, as mentioned, this teaching claims its authority from supposedly being an earlier way of doing things, which is supposedly earlier than the Torah command. But the question is this teaching the Torah commands? Whenever someone teaches against the Torah commands and is clever about it, in my experience, there is always some reasoning given behind it. There is always some explanation as to why it is supposedly okay to add to the law or take away from the law, and usually people try to cover up the fact that they are teaching contrary to the Torah when they do it. But apparently not so here. The answer is clear that this teaching is dismissing the Torah command because it is saying that the Torah command is not the right way. Even the Shem Tov version didn't fix that. There is actually more in this passage that one could take issue with, but I will just leave it on that point. And if someone had thought that maybe the other Gospels had credibility, the Gospel of Mark forbids divorce altogether in Mark 10:9. Coming back to our scale of teaching Torah, this is a clear example of disregarding part of the Torah. He has an explanation for why he is disregarding part of the Torah, but the fact still remains that it is disregarding part of the Torah. So what do we have as far as Matthew 5 overall, and these different categories on the scale? At one point or another, every single box was ticked. Every single category is represented here. As we know, there can be a pro-Torah statement, and there can also be an anti-Torah statement which exists alongside it. This is just how the Gospels are. Even the Shem Tov Hebrew Matthew is this way. And the only way we can get any real idea of whether something is pro-Torah or is not is by studying the Torah commands for themselves, seeing what they say for themselves. If the Torah is only read with the assumption that we can somehow force it to fit with the New Testament writings, then the mind will always find a way to do it. We will never be able to see what the Torah says for itself. And what all of this is going to come down to is, where are we placing importance? Where is the priority? If the commandment of the Creator is the priority, and if we really want to return to His ways and seek to understand what He commanded in the text of the Torah, like we would see in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 10, and if we really want to test these later works against what the Torah says, then we will have to painfully grapple with some past beliefs along the way. The mind is a very tricky thing, and it will find a way to deceive us into keeping a past belief if it thinks that we need to. And likewise, if we are just starting to see this problem with many of the writings which come after the Torah, and if we are able to see how this is something worthy of our attention and worthy of our consideration, that it is a matter of whether we are truly seeking to do right in the eyes of the Creator, then we want to strive to resolve that as soon as possible before our mind tricks us into not worrying about it. Do not fear to seek the truth of what is commanded and to test things according to the commands of the Creator, whether that be with matters of teachings like these, whether that be with prophecies like the this generation prophecies which occur in Matthew, or the prophecy about some not tasting death until they see the Son of Man coming with His kingdom. The question is whether a person is truly willing to continue seeking truth.